Most of the students don't struggle with their literature review because they are not capable. They struggle because they do not have a system. You may read papers, you may use AI tools, but when it's time to put everything together, you feel disconnected. You don't know how to turn all that into a clear, structured literature review. In this video, I will show you a simple step-by-step system with a ready-to-use template that we have developed at Grad Collective that will help you to go from scattered papers and AI notes into a clean, supervisor-ready literature review. If you have been feeling stuck or overwhelmed with your literature review, I am very sure this will give you clarity right away. At Grad Collective, we have worked with over 300 masters and PhD students, and honestly, one of the most common places where students get stuck is the literature review. Why does it feel so difficult? I've seen 4 main reasons. Number 1, most students don't have a clear system. They start reading papers without knowing what to look for. So everything feels important and nothing feels organized. Secondly, they try to start writing too early. Before the literature is structured, the themes are clear, students start to write, which leads to confusion. And third, there's a lot of confusion between summary and critical analysis. Students think that they are reviewing literature, but they're actually just describing papers one after the other. And finally, they're not sure what supervisors are actually looking for. So they end up guessing, and that creates even more stress. Let me show you exactly how to do a literature review step by step. And this is the exact same system that I use to coach my clients who are doing their master's or their PhD. If you follow this process, I'm very sure that you would not feel stuck anymore, and you will know exactly what to do first and what follows after. The first step is obviously to find the right papers, right? And let me show you how I would actually do this. There are, of course, traditional databases like Google Scholar, and you also have some advanced AI-enabled tools and systems like Research Rabbit or Elicit or Consensus. There are various AI tools, but let me show you the traditional way. I think there is still value in having us know how to do this more efficiently by just starting with Google Scholar. And we can, of course, I can also show you how I would do this with Research Rabbit. First mistake that students make usually is they start searching something very broad. Like, for example, if my research topic is student engagement in online learning, students might type just student engagement, or they might just type online learning, which doesn't bring you relevant literature, right? Instead, I would suggest that we type something like student engagement in online learning, higher education. I know the sentence is not complete, but that essentially would bring you some literature that is relevant to the research topic. Now, what is more important is always sort papers. I must say something like, always make sure you select the papers that's more recent, preferably less than 2 years old. And then from that point, start skimming through the title of the articles. You might see some papers very relevant to your research topic, and see how much citations has happened on this literature, right? And there are 2 different approaches I would do. One, you identify your seed paper by looking at the number of citations and the relevance with your research topic. So in this case, let's say this is a most cited paper, and it also has some relevance to what I'm looking for. In that case, by having me click on cited by brings more recent papers, right? I could see papers from 2024 and 2025. So we call this paper as a seed paper. Or you can click on related articles that again brings articles that's similar to the article that you have taken as a seed paper. So essentially the idea is not to start downloading all the papers from here. The idea is to find papers that's most relevant. So if the PDF is available, you can directly download it from there, or you could use your university library access to download these articles. So start opening probably 2, 3, 4 articles and identify them as which one you want to collect as a seed paper. From there, you can then identify other relevant articles, probably most recent ones, maybe much higher citations exist on some other papers. So start identifying those papers. And specifically, when you look for these papers, you're looking for titles, you're looking for the years and the citation counts. So you really want to start with 1 or 2 highly relevant papers, and then from there, you're going much deeper by looking at the citation and the related articles. And if you want to speed up this even more, we can use tools like Research Rabbit or Elicit, and I'll show you quickly how we could use some of those tools to identify papers. All right, let me show you a faster way to find papers using AI. And I'm going to use Research Rabbit. So similar to Google Scholar, I'll start searching with the same research topic, which is student engagement in online learning. So I'm going to just hit search, and it's going to bring me a list of articles, and I'm going to select some articles that's most recent and also relevant to my research topic. And if I choose relatively recent, which I'm seeing here, yeah, sure. And then I'm going to hit search. It is going to bring me a sort of map where the x-axis represent the year of publishing and the y-axis represent more citation. So you're going to look something more recent yet decently cited that shows the relevance of the paper. And the beauty of this sort of node system is that it shows the connection of a seed paper with the other articles. Like for example, if I were to select this, it shows me this is related to student motivation and engagement in the higher education. And you may also see that this is also related to somewhat similar to the previous. For example, if I were to select one of the articles from here, this article shows factors that affect student engagement in online learning in health professions education. And if I were to select this may also be relevant or related to the previous article. So in that way, once you identify your seed paper, you can then find relevant other papers. And from here, you can start saving those papers in the form of like collection inside this tool, or you could just make a note of this and go search that on Google Scholar and start downloading the papers. So this whole exercise that we're doing right now is A, to identify seed papers, B, to identify related articles that are more relevant and also relatively cited by other articles. So in this way, it becomes much faster to discover papers and also understand the entire research landscape. Moving on, and step number 2 is the metrics method. This is unfortunately where most students would go wrong. They read papers and they forget everything. Instead, what I use with my clients is this literature review metrics. And let me show you this. It's very simple. Here, each row, as you can see, represent one paper. And across various columns, I'm tracking a few key things. I'm tracking research objective, methods used, key findings, limitations, some theory or framework they may have used. If you also have data analysis, you could indicate what kind of data and what's the population, what's the sample size. And the purpose of this metrics is super simple. Instead of keeping everything in your head, you're literally building a simple structure of your literature that you've read so far. And as you keep adding more papers, something magical will start happening. You will start noticing that there are patterns across different studies. For example, a lot of studies would indicate that the motivation play a key role in the improvement of online learning. You may see papers agree, you may see papers contradict each other, and most importantly, you will start identifying some research gaps. That right there is the foundation of your literature review. So once you reach this stage, you are no longer confused about what to write. You are simply translating what you already see into structured paragraphs. All right. Now we move to the part most students struggle with, which is actually writing the literature review. But here is the key thing to understand. At this point, you should not be guessing what to write anymore, because you have found the right articles, you have found the right papers, and you have organized them in your metrics. Then the writing becomes a lot more simpler. This is exactly why I've created this structured literature review template. And let me show you this. This template is designed to do one thing: remove confusion when you start writing. Instead of asking, what should I write next? You simply follow clear sections, answering guided prompts, and build your review step by step. And this is based on what supervisors actually expect, which is clear structure, logical flow, and critical thinking. So I'll walk you through each section of this template and show you exactly what to write, how to think, and how to connect it back to your metrics. If you follow this properly, you can go from a blank page to a complete literature review much faster. Let me start with the first section. Before we start writing, there is one quick step you should do first. And this is a simple pre-check. It takes about 10 minutes and it will help you avoid losing easy marks. I've seen a lot of students lose marks because of wrong referencing, missing sections, or formatting issues. So here, you just go through this table, fill things quickly. For example, what's your word count? Which referencing style are you using? How many sources do you need? Sometimes university do provide you a template or thesis writing guidelines, or if this is an assignment, they might give you some instructions on that. So you have to check what required structure is needed. What's the limits on the similarity? For example, the plagiarism as well as the Turnitin scores, which also includes AI score, and the submission format. That's it. It's not very complicated. Think of it as like quick check before you begin, so you don't have to fix things later. Once this is done, you are ready to start writing. All right, so now we're starting the actual writing. Let's begin with section number 1, which is introduction to research area. So I'm going to flip my screen here and I'm showing you the first section, which is introduction to the research area. We'll start with the background of the research field that you've selected. Now, this section is very straightforward. You're not yet reviewing your studies. You're not supposed to start adding in text citations. You're simply setting the context. You're telling the story where you start with broad and then you start narrow down to your research topic. The template already gives you clear structure. Just follow the prompts and some examples that I've given here. You essentially on a high level need just 2 paragraphs, where your paragraph number 1, something like this. You just introduce your general topic, explain why it matters and mention why it is relevant. And then you would need a more, I would think, a bit more narrowed paragraph where you narrow down your focus, describe the problem, and show why the research is needed. Once again, you're not listing your studies, you're just building the understanding. So don't overcomplicate this. You're just moving from more general to a bit more specific. So try to avoid common mistakes here, like I repeat myself, don't list studies here, don't jump into the research gap, and don't also be very vague in your writing. After, you will move to your section number 2, which is more of like the purpose of this literature review. This is even simpler. Here you're just telling the reader what this chapter will cover. Again, no detailed studies, just follow the structure. State the overall topic, mention 2 to 3 key themes that you have identified here. So essentially, you see here, you must have identified as key themes from your metrics. So just start listing those key themes on just a few lines. That's it. Explain why these themes matter and show how this leads to your research, which is very important. If you look at this example, you can clearly see what should be done. You're basically giving the reader a roadmap of what's coming next. And it's that simple, your section number 1. All right, now let's move to the theoretical framework. This section is just about one thing, explaining the main theory behind your research. You're not listing many theories. Ideally, you're focusing on one key theory, and optionally, a second one can be added if required. How do you write this? The template gives you a very simple structure. You essentially need 1 or 2 paragraphs. Your paragraph number 1 can be the name of the theory that you are using to explain your research problem or to explain your research. If you look at this example here that I've given, it introduces self-determination theory, and it explains very clearly, no complexity. So the idea here for this section is to keep it very simple. You're explaining the theory like you would to someone new, right? And your paragraph number 2 that's given here is more about like, how does this theory relate to your topic? Why is it useful here? In other words, you're basically saying this theory helps explain my research problem. Now, in some cases, you would have more than one theories. In that case, you can explain your theory number 1, and then you can explain your theory number 2, and most importantly, show how they are connected. I repeat, don't overcomplicate this section. You're just simply showing what theory you're using and why it matters. That's it. We can now discuss more about the upcoming literature review themes. And once again, your theory can also be identified from the metrics that you have completed prior to start writing your literature review. All right, now we move to the most important part, which is reviewing the literature by themes. Now, what you're doing here, you're not summarizing one paper at a time. You're grouping studies together under a common theme that you may have identified as you were working with your literature metrics. So, as I said, you're grouping studies together under a common theme. And in the template, I've given an example, which is motivation and student engagement. So you start with a subsection, which essentially explains the overview of the theme. Define the theme and say why it matters. And it's most importantly, you link it back to your research topic. You look at the example here, it clearly explains what motivation is and why it matters in online learning. So you're slowly setting the context for this theme before you actually dive into more details. Now, when it comes to key findings, here is where most students struggle. Instead of writing randomly, you can use a simple structure called the PEER method, where the P stands for point, I stands for illustration or evidence, E stands for explanation or explain, and then R stands for repeat or link. So if you see each paragraph, you start with the idea and you support it with studies, you explain what it means, and you link it back to the topic, which is what the PEER method is all about. Here comes the big question. Essentially, I learned how to do it using PEER method. Now comes the part where I have to know how to organize the writing. For that, you can follow a simple flow from the template. So you can start first with, you group the studies that say similar things, like what do most researchers agree on? So you start with that and then move to the second paragraph where you explain what are the differences, show the studies where studies disagree or add new perspectives. And finally, you can touch upon limitations in the gap that you see as you were reading through the literature. Some of the guiding questions here would be, what are the common limitations that you see? What is still missing? How does this connect to your research question? So this is where your literature reviews start becoming strong. You're not listing studies, but you're showing patterns and gaps. So once you finish one theme like this, you can repeat it for the same structure. You can repeat it for other themes. For example, we started with motivation. Now you can go online learning and technology adoption. You can do online learning and learning environment. So that essentially, as you do the same structure, as you do the same exercise, you start seeing your literature review will start forming a shape. All right. Now we move to one of the most important sections, which is critical analysis and synthesis. What you're doing here at this stage, you're not summarizing studies anymore. You're bringing everything together. You're helping the reader understand what patterns exist, where studies agree or disagree, and what is missing. This is where your writing start to sound more like a researcher. And how do you structure this is very important. So in this template, I've made it very easy for you. So essentially think of this as like three different sections, three different paragraphs. Your first paragraph is more of like reflecting on the patterns you have seen. Like, what do most studies say? What findings are repeated? Here is where again metrics is very handy and helpful, where you will start seeing some key findings that repeat by itself. So that's where you identify the patterns. Then you move on to differences and limitations that you have seen as you have read these 15, 20 articles. You may see, reflect on the questions like, what do studies differ? What are the common limitations that you have seen? And then finally, you indicate the overall insight. What does all this mean essentially? Why do you care? How do these themes connect? What does this lead to? So reflecting on those questions is actually your paragraph number 3. I would say section number 3, depending upon the word count that you have decided. It's also important to understand how to think while you're writing. Some simple signals here would be things like several studies have found this to highlight the patterns. Similarly, and then however, most studies so use these words like I've given in the example to highlight the patterns, the differences and limitations, the overall insights, things like that. So this again helps you to compare studies, connect ideas, and it also shows critical thinking. I repeat, you're not listing studies, you're combining insights across studies. And some of the common mistakes to avoid is don't list back-to-back paper summaries, don't ignore limitations, and also don't skip the overall conclusion. Once this section is complete, it clearly shows your understanding of the literature, and that's when we can move on to the final conclusion. All right, now we come to the most important part, which is the research gap. What you're doing here is you're clearly showing what existing studies have covered, what is missing, and what your study will do. And this is where your literature review connects directly to your research. How do you write this? Again, keep it very simple. Just one short paragraph would be enough, and follow the exact same structure that I've provided in the templates. Start with what studies focus on based on your literature review, then show what is missing. Clearly state the gap that you have understood, and finally, connect back to your study, what your study will do. If you look at this example that I've given here, it does exactly this step by step. So the key thing to remember here is you're not being very vague here. You're being very specific about what's missing. While you write this section, ask yourself, what is already well studied? This comes from your metrics. What is underexplored? What keeps coming as a limitation? This leads you to your research gap. Some of the common mistakes to avoid here: don't say more research is needed, don't introduce a new topic, and don't forget to say what your study will do. Once this is done, your literature review is fully connected to your research, and you can start setting your final reference list, your in-text citations, and complete your literature review. Let me tell you something most students don't realize. Your supervisor is not expecting you to summarize papers. What they are actually looking for is this. They want to see you understand the research landscape better. That means, can you identify patterns across studies? Can you compare different approaches? Can you clearly point out what is missing? Because a weak literature review, which I've often seen, may sound something like this. Paper A says this, paper B says this. That's not analysis, that's just description. What they actually want to see is synthesis. That's when your writing starts to sound like a master's or PhD level researcher. And that is exactly why the system we've discussed works. when you use a metrics to organize your papers and you start writing theme by theme, you naturally move from summarizing papers to actually start analyzing the research field. So if your literature review feels weak right now, it's not because you're not working hard. It's because you're missing the structure supervisors expect. And once you understand the shift, everything about your writing starts to improve. Indeed, a literature review is not actually very complicated. It only feels difficult because most students are working without a clear system. So everything feels overwhelming, unstructured, and confusing. But once you start following a structure like collect the literature, organize them, and start writing, it becomes much more mechanical. You're not doing any guesses. You're simply following clear steps, using a proven template, and you're building your review systematically. And this is exactly how students go from feeling stuck to actually finishing their literature review. So don't overcomplicate this. Focus on the system and the writing will follow. I wish you all the very best.